So tonight I'd love to talk a little bit about what I call slow motion materiality. I think this is in keeping with the theme of land and different perspectives on land, although maybe in a slightly abstracted state, and then in other ways in a very, very materially particular state. So land like this type of land, dirt and soil. To just give an overview, like a historical overview of my practice, I've worked on installation design, as well as public art projects, and then artifacts, as well as regional proposals. So it kind of spans a huge range, and kind of what I'm flashing up here are all the projects that I'm not going to talk about right now. Because I would love to, for a moment, just talk about the particular aspect of my practice that engages earth and materials in one way or another. And in particular, I'm going to start that off with talking about ceramic slip casting, which for me, I kind of fell into quickly after graduating, after completing my master's degree in architecture. I had a great education. It was almost completely digital and virtual, and I realized that the one thing that I was missing was any engagement with materiality. So I decided I should take that on myself after finishing my degree. And I jumped into slip casting, which, if you haven't done it, is a kind of magical process where you pour liquid clay into a plaster mold. The plaster mold absorbs some of the water from the clay and then forms like this thick scum wherever the liquid clay was touching the plaster. You pour out the extra clay, and then you've got this shell cast, which is used for everything from little trinkets that my grandmother used to make, to industrial processes like making toilet bowls. It's actually it's the only way to make toilet bowls at this moment because of the complexity necessary to produce the plumbing inside. There's no other way to do it at the moment. So I wanted to take this historical process of slip casting and try to figure out what it would mean for digital fabrication. In particular, I started this project modeling in Rhino a very generic design. I say generic, and that's not good or bad. It's just something that for me held little interest, and I think that was intentionally so. The idea was to find out what the process of fabrication would offer the project beyond what I could model digitally in Rhino. So this was just a starting point, and then the challenge was to just figure out, okay, what does it mean to digitally fabricate that, to mill directly into plaster, produce a mold that basically would need to negotiate digital precision with the unruly world of materials and clay in particular. And the interface for that negotiation is right here. If this is a cross-section through a plaster mold, and if this is the clay thickness that you can achieve, the kind of shell cast that can come out of that mold, you can see that there are certain correlations between any time at an interior corner condition, you've got double the amount of plaster removing moisture, so that means you get double wall thickness of clay, and then the inverse of that is true at corner conditions where you've got half the amount of plaster pulling water out, and therefore you get half the wall thickness. There are other issues that are less predictable: ambient humidity, ambient air temperature, gravity, that can start to cause other variations inside of this cast. So what starts with this digital desire for infinite precision that can then be reproduced in the physical world via the mold starts to produce something that is less predictable. Clearly, there's an added layer of just the kind of detail of the tooling paths that we start to see here. And in this particular case, the orientation of those tooling paths were meant to guide our eye, our vision, into the interior of this form. And I think, this is a relatively simple exercise, but for me, this is a way of training myself in using earth and materials in particular to start to inflect something that started as a relatively generically designed digital project, but offers a lot more to it. From my perspective, I see that everything that has been offered here through the material techniques are more interesting than just the simple design and geometry that I had in Rhino to begin with. So taking that as a starting point for how I started to use earth and materials initially, and then expanding beyond that, I think quite to some much larger, both disciplinarily and then in terms of scale, ways of thinking about not just earth and materials as building materials or construction materials, but as a way of thinking about the world. And in particular, some of the behaviors that I had noticed working with clay at one scale seemed to have very clear corollaries with the way the earth moves at much larger scales. And so that was maybe an excuse to start thinking about the way that architecture also operates at much larger scales. We tend, let's say, we can fool ourselves into believing that we make objects, that we make architecture as discrete buildings. But of course, I think we know that that's not entirely true. In this project, the Geological Atlas of the Built Metropolis started by thinking about this term that many of you have heard, the Anthropocene, and thinking about its geological origins. The idea that the Anthropocene is the geological era or epoch that starts at the moment where humans have more influence on the shape of the planet than natural geological processes. So what does it mean to think about anthropogenic or human-induced geology? At the time I started this, I was based in Chicago, and I just started looking at geological maps of Chicago, and then a different scale of a geological map of Chicago in which you can see the different zones of different types of sediment that have built up by the kind of slow receding of Lake Michigan. And then what you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here in light yellow is actually anthropogenic fill. So it's basically man-made, human-induced movement of materials to fill in the lakeshore there, construct a rail line, construct Navy Pier. And so I think there was something interesting that this geological map of Chicago admitted very obviously that some of the geology there was not naturally, didn't arrive by natural processes. At the same time, to me, what's interesting is if you look at the architecture there, which is just rendered as black, basically that which is other, that which is not geology, the architecture, which in this case probably accounts for significantly more mineral content, just more stuff, than the fill that we see that's been indicated as anthropogenic fill. Here we've got like this oversight, this lack of understanding on the part of geologists that in terms of mineral content, the architecture makes up a significant portion of the city's geology that was just ignored in this situation. Back in Los Angeles, this is a geological map of the city of Los Angeles, and if you zoom into the San Fernando Valley, you can start to see these geological scars across the landscape. If you keep zooming in on them, we can kind of tell that that is not the language, the formal language of geology. And what we have is basically the fill that's been used to raise the city's freeways above the ground. And then you can even see the cuts through that fill for all of the city streets, the city grid that passes beneath the freeway. And what I love about this is that we can see that now geologists are starting to think about not only the human movement of geological materials, but also something down to the scale of architecture. If we think about the cut of a typical urban street cutting through that fill, this is an architectural question, certainly an urban question, that geologists are now starting to map. So what I wanted to do was try to figure out, okay, if we were to use this same logic here, if geologists, and I would say by extension now architects, need to be responsible for thinking about any materials, any geological materials that are found within the city, whether or not they've been placed there naturally or placed there by humans, what would a map of that city start to look like? So I decided to start that with one building. I'm hopping back and forth between Chicago and Los Angeles because at the time I was moving back and forth kind of regularly between Chicago and Los Angeles. And this building, the Monadnock building, which is kind of an immensely famous building in terms of architectural history because it was at this moment in history where it's the last load-bearing masonry building. So it's kind of like the tallest last building before steel frame structures came into being. So in this building, you've got, brick walls that at the base of the building are about 6 feet thick. I was interested in this building not only because it represented this kind of tectonic shift in architectural construction, but also because the name of it, Monadnock, comes from geology. It's a geological term that simply means basically an outcropping of one particular type of rock, usually igneous rock or granite. Something like this would not technically be considered a Monadnock, but it is kind of similar. And we can imagine that this building might have been given that name because it's meant to look like a geological feature. It doesn't have a lot of ornamentation. But I would like to engage in kind of a speculative fiction that the owner, the architect, decided that they would name this building the Monadnock building because they wanted it to be interpreted as a geological feature in the city of Chicago. And if we were to take that fiction seriously, that means as any good geologist would need to do, we would want to trace those materials, the geological materials, backwards in time and space. This is something that geologists are really good at, something that architects are getting better at doing, but I think we still have some work to do in terms of holding ourselves accountable for where our materials come from and where they go once they're no longer architecture. So, in particular, the granite that we see here was quarried just west of St. Louis, Missouri. We can see what those quarries look like. The iron ore that produced the steel for the building came from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, was shipped through the Great Lakes down to Chicago, rendered into steel in the Chicago Iron Works, Steel Works, and we can see the sources of the material here in Minnesota. Of course, this almost looks like the Grand Canyon, but of course, this is also all anthropogenic geology. This is man-made. So if we think about what prior states of architecture look like, we could say this is a prior state of architecture. And I think that almost raises the question of how do we start to represent architecture if we want to think through architecture and architectural materials before they look like architecture. This is certainly one way that we've all been trained very well to render or to represent architecture. This could be another way of thinking about architecture, just a spreadsheet of materials and material quantities. This is a really nice image by Kiel Mo that lists all of the ingredients as architecture of one particular building in terms of the constituent components in that building. So I think these are in a way, two different extremes of thinking about architecture, one as image and the other as ingredients. And I'm wondering, are there other ways to think about the prior states of architecture that might be included in a building? So how might we develop a new public imaginary that I think we also could think about architecture differently as architects. So this is basically a quick study that I did of all of the construction materials embodied in the Monadnock building. The Monadnock building was constructed in several phases, so that's why you can see the division between those different blocks of the Monadnock building. And here you can see a simple listing of all of those the primary construction materials contained in that building. And of course, everything above the green stratum there is void space, which is the habitable space of the building, the leasable square footage, we could say. This is interesting because if you just, again, look at construction materials in the building and the leftover space that's given over to program, that would start to change if we were to take into account not just construction materials, but the raw materials that went into the production of those construction materials. And if we held ourselves accountable not just for the steel used in the building, but all of the iron ore, let's say anytime you're quarrying rock, there's about a 2-to-1 ratio in terms of the material that you extract from the earth versus the material that ends up going in the building. So about double the amount of what you use in the building is what's, or let's say the equal amount of material that's used in the building is what's wasted. It's just kind of lost in the process of moving from raw materials into construction materials. So this is a different way of kind of representing those architectural materials as they become or embody architecture. But here we can also start to trace a little bit of some of the history of those materials, again, the same way that a geologist would. And then I think there was another representational project in terms of trying to figure out how to represent that building as geology. In this case, just kind of showing it as a fissured geological feature, but then also trying to think through what it would mean to show different strata of material in an architectural object. So then I think looking at architectural materials as they start to move across the landscape became the focus of the last two projects that I'll show here. And one of them was this project called Trajan's Hollow, which started by looking at another monument, this one in Rome. I know ISU has a Rome program. Some of you may know this monument. It's at the Piazza Venezia, kind of the transit hub for all the buses in Rome. Most people just kind of drive past this on a bus, in a car, on a motorino. But it is one of the best documented ancient monuments in Rome. Probably the Colosseum is number 1, the Pantheon is number 2, and this would be number 3. I was working on a book that basically was trying to reinterpret that monument, looking at its materials and how its materials have moved over time. Part of that is simply just the trajectory of those materials coming from Carrara down to Rome. For me, that meant following that journey backwards, going to Carrara, trying to understand the impact not only of that one monument and its materials on the landscape, let's say a somewhat distant landscape, but here, a whole history of buildings, of construction materials, of products that have been quarried out of these mountains. And what's amazing is that what looks like snow up there, that's actually just all the quarries, and you can kind of see the gouge into the mountain. I mean, this is truly operations at a planetary scale that we have engaged as humans. And I think trying to follow these materials both backwards and forwards in time and space, and doing that then also over the lifespan of the monument itself. So one of the things that monument is very, very famous for is the fact that it has this scroll that's kind of like a historical narrative of Emperor Trajan's exploits and conquest of different areas, especially of modern-day Romania. But here you can see that there's there's a set of 43 windows on this column, which means that it's not simply just a monument, it's actually architecture, it's habitable. And I would say that, maybe if we engage in another act of speculative fiction, we might say that those windows served another purpose. They weren't just for looking out from the interior, but potentially, if you are able to visit the interior of it, what's amazing is that you can see that over 2,000 years, with a lot of acid rain, the marble exterior and that really famous bas-relief on the exterior is transforming into calcium bicarbonate, and it's slowly passing from the exterior to the interior through these windows. So we could say that the column is turning itself outside in, and you've got this cascading movement of materials down the spiral staircase. As they move down that spiral staircase, they then slowly find themselves moved out into the city streets of Rome, into the sewers, then into the Tiber River, and ultimately out to the Tiber Delta, where over 2 millennia, over 2,000 years, we basically have something like 7 kilometers of sediment that's been added to the coastline. And although, a small fraction of that is material that's been moving off of Trajan's column, we could say that over 2,000 years, a significant portion of Roman architecture, of the historical Roman architecture, ends up in this delta here. So it is a literal transformation of the city into what we call landscape. And I think then my project was to try to figure out how to document that with some degree of precision. I think a lot of these statements that I'm making, we probably understand intuitively that this is true. It's not a shock to anybody to say that, yeah, over 2,000 years, architecture erodes. But I think a little bit part of what my project was to try to attempt to document that the same way that hundreds of years of architectural scholars who have gone to Rome have documented idealized geometries. And this was a way to try to document a different version of history that I believe had been ignored over all that time. So how might we document the erosion of this monument? Digital scanning might be helpful in that. And then for me also, material reproduction of that monument was hugely important. So this was not just an academic exercise, but it was a way of trying to understand the column by reproducing it. So this was my studio space in Rome, at the American Academy in Rome. This was the footprint of the original Trajan's column if it were transposed in my studio space. And I decided that I would try to reconstruct it both at scales larger than and smaller than the original. So this is kind of like almost an industrial design endeavor to try to produce Trajan's column at 1/10 the scale of the original. So I didn't produce the whole thing, I produced one chunk. The column is constructed in chunks, and I decided I would produce one chunk of that using the same materials but new techniques. So rendered out of the same marble, but using contemporary techniques for sculpting marble. If you go to Carrara now, you find large marble carving robots. So this was the marble chunk that was dedicated to carving my small likeness of Trajan's column. And then at a smaller scale, and then using digital technology, the robot cannot carve with the same highly specific detail that the Romans and the slaves that were working on this original could do. So basically what I decided is that each human figure would just be one cut of the machine into that marble chunk. So then that offers us something like this, where the narrative becomes a set of rhythms of different characters and groups of characters, rather than an understanding of who is saying what to who. So what it means is that somebody who really, really knows the column, an art historian, they would be able to, as they move up the inside of this new version of the column that I'm proposing, they could understand where they are in the narrative by feeling the rhythm of characters there. This is the original footprint of Trajan's column. If I were to go larger, 1.5 times the scale of the original, that produces this. In this case, I decided to not use marble, but instead the material that had produced all of the copies and casts of Trajan's column over the years. So here, plaster, and then instead of doing one drum, I did one really thin cross-section of the column. It's about 5 centimeters thick, but you can see in any kind of slice through the column, you're always going to have a core, the exterior drum, and then one cut through a stair, through one of the steps. So here then you can see like this not only shows us the cross-section of the column, but it asks us to get a little, to sneak down in there and understand the potential erosion of that column that's been happening over time. And I think this, this attempt to render the column as something that is not static over time, but something that actually moves and still has repercussions on its form, was the crux of this project. And this project then, which is the one that ends up here as a part of the Beauty Investigated exhibition, was, I think, expanding that research and trying to understand what happens when our architecture moves into our landscape. What kinds of repercussions does it actually have, not only culturally, but ecologically and environmentally. And here I was actually asked to look at the entire western watershed for the Po River Valley. And the Po is like the biggest river in Italy. It's kind of like the Mississippi for the United States. It drains the entire northern half of Italy, basically. This was, my assignment was to somehow analyze and look at this entire region, which felt a little bit daunting as a starting point. So I decided that I was going to be based in one particular town called Biella, which was in the foothills of the Italian Alps. And I decided I would just start looking at the one river that ran through that town as a starting point. So you can see here the town of Biella, and the name of the river that was in that town was called the Cervo River. So I decided I would try and understand where that river comes from and then where it ends up. Where does that water, as it moves through the city of Biella, where does it start? Where does it end? And in this particular case, it starts up in the mountains near a UNESCO-designated monument, and it ends before the confluence with another river. It ends basically in the rice-growing paddies of the plains of the Po River Valley. So it unites something that I think we also kind of intuitively understand as being true. A lot of rivers start up in the mountains. There's the snow melt, and then we can follow that down into the plains. And so within the first few days when I arrived for this project, I started by going up into the mountains and just following that stream down as it moves past this kind of famous monument called Oropa, O-R-O-P-A. And it was kind of interesting to me that this would carry UNESCO designated status. What that also means is that, from the way I was looking at this, if the materials that eroded from this monument found their way into the river, would that also mean that if we tracked them downstream, would there be some kind of UNESCO designation that would still hold true for those architectural materials as they leave the architectural form that they started? So I would just started by kind of documenting some of the materials in the state of erosion in these monumental structures. And then continuing the journey downstream, still kind of this beautiful mountain stream that then slowly starts to come into contact with more regulated geometries of the city. It starts to become channelized and used. This is an irrigation ditch You can see, obviously, it starts to interface with different types of infrastructure. And then if you look closely, you can start to see some blue bags here. It starts to become used also as a site of informal trash dump. So this is not just in Italy, but in a lot of places, some of these waterways become areas of dereliction. And then in even more, let's say, intentional ways, but historically intentional, the textile industry that was here used the river as a dumping ground for a lot of the chemicals that they were using in their colorants and the textile dyes that they were using that were part and parcel with that industry. So what that meant was that the industry in this town, the textile industry, which was something that had left a kind of beautiful legacy of all of these late 19th century factory buildings, and which the town was very proud of. We could say that these buildings were kind of contributing their architectural sediment into the waterways at the same time that they were contributing legacy toxins into the waterways left over from the textile industry. So this idea of sediment as having both positive and negative understandings, valences. The river then would continue downstream, and the water and sediment would find their way into the rice-growing paddies of these plains here. So the first way then of understanding the impact of that particular industry, the rice-growing industry on the landscape, was to just kind of take a satellite image, which was just about just an elevational map, but it's a very high-resolution elevational map, so topographic map of that area. And here you can see all of the lot divisions because each one of these rice paddies has to be slightly higher than the one next to it. You can't see this when you go there in person, but this map shows us all of those different terraced rice paddies. Again, this is something that we kind of know intuitively, like rice paddies in general are terraced, but this is something that you absolutely cannot perceive when you're there. What it also means is that there's a very clear downstream relationship between a lot of these rice paddies where they're inheriting their water from the rice paddy that's just upstream or up terrace from them, which is significant because there's a small minority of some of these rice-producing farms that are trying to think in terms of organic production, but they're inheriting their water from conventional farming, industrial farming operations upstream. So however good these organic farms are at trying to regulate how much they use pesticides, herbicides, again, they're still inheriting all of those toxins from some of their upstream neighbors. For me, I decided that I wanted to start by physically sampling, looking for different minerals and other toxins along this particular waterway. And so that was about just putting my body out there and trying to find some samples of different materials along the way. And then also just testing what sediment looks like, almost just visually and materially. So what happens when one type of mineral is juxtaposed against another by its relationship, let's say by the movement of water. And this is kind of an amazing image that this drone photographer gave to me, which was about this moment where these two waterways, one which brings water from the Western Alps and one which brings water from the Central Alps, where there's two different types of geology. You can see where they mix here, and there's absolutely a very evident mixture of two different mineralogies inside of the waterways. So the site samples that I was taking just started by like digging up materials, but then also was kind of counting on some of the expertise in this region. It happens to be there are some gold deposits in some of the waterways here. So there's actually a tradition of gold panning. So I worked with a champion gold panner to actually try to find materials that were not only natural, but also man-made materials that had found their way into the river. And gold panning, which of course works with specific density, is very good at finding things like lead and iron that might find their way from industry into the waterways. There were other types of collection that were kind of just very obvious ones. As I said, the waterways are used as an informal dump, a lot of times specifically for construction materials. If somebody were to change out, renovate their kitchen, they would bring the old tiles here and just dump them in the riverways. So you can find a lot of this type of anthropogenic materials that have been left in the water, in the riverbed. And things like eroded bricks, as well as river rocks that share the same geological composition as some of the region's architecture. Another set of samples then was just doing LiDAR scans to understand some of the architecture in its current state, right? So not how it was designed, not the idealized version that historians might be looking at, but the architecture as it exists at this moment in time. So that might be the UNESCO monument that was this sacred chapel up in the mountains, but that might also be some of the area's industrial buildings that were left over from the textile industry. And then also this, it just so happened that I ended up exhibiting this research in one of those former industrial buildings that was a part of the textile industry. So I brought all of these samples back to my studio, the kind of hand-dug samples, worked with the Geology Department at the University of Turin to analyze those samples, to look for the mineral content of those different sediment samples. I also worked with a archivist in the area, in the region's archive that archives all of the different industrial information from the textile industry. So these are like just shelves and shelves of catalogs from all of the different textile manufacturers that included all of their sample books for the different colorants, the different textiles that they were producing. And then my first task was to just map for the public all of those different sites and the different materials that were discovered at each one of those sites. So what you can see here up in the top left-hand corner is the site up in the mountains where the UNESCO designated sacred chapel of Europa is located. And then that stream that runs down, it's first called Europa, but then it's called Cervo, the Cervo stream. And then these 9 sites here are the 9 sites where I was taking those samples, both physical material samples, but then also the digital scans of, let's say, the kind of archaeological scans of the area's architecture. And then my exhibition design basically ended up creating a pedestal for each one of those sites and displaying all of the materials that I had discovered there, whether they were naturally contributed into the rivers or anthropogenically, human contributions into the rivers. So here each pedestal contains samples of what were discovered there, and sometimes those samples were again just like rocks and the geological analysis of those rocks and the sediment. But then other times it was the contributions of industry that would have been located there, the synthetic colorants that would have found their way into the waterways of this region. So this is basically like not a full-scale reproduction of the river, but maybe like a quarter scale. Well, that's probably even a little generous. It's not quite a model scale, but somewhere between a model and a full-scale representation or reconstruction of that Cervo River, with all of the area's contributions into that waterway. And then the arrival of that water down into the rice paddies down below. So again, everybody who's lived in this town can tell you, if they're over 30 years old, they can tell you about, 1 week when I was growing up, when I was a kid, the river would turn orange. The next week it would turn purple. The next week it would turn fuchsia. It was all based on whatever colors they were using in the textile industry at that moment in time. So this simple act of kind of tracing the movement of those materials from the mountains down to the rice paddies quickly became a little convoluted when I started to understand that this is the larger watershed for the western Po Valley. If you look at the watershed for this one particular river that I was looking here in the center, these are all the natural waterways. These are all the man-made waterways, and you can see that they start to cross watershed boundaries, right? So it really starts to confuse what we understand as being a watershed and a basin that drains into a particular area down below. If we keep zooming in, we can see these multiple layers of human construction of waterways over hundreds of years. So basically, this kind of condition of all of these mixtures of different sources of water then meant that this pink crescent here, which is what I had first identified as the area where the UNESCO materials, the sediment from the UNESCO monument, would arrive into the rice plains down below. You can start to see that moment where it becomes mixed with something that's an aqua color. That's a moment where there's actually a canal bringing water from a totally different watershed hundreds of kilometers away. And if we zoom out and look at the rest of those rice fields, you can see that they're getting their water from the mountains, yes, but from a totally complicated system of mountains, which is this upstream inheritance that, again, is like very similar to the one where you're inheriting your water from your rice farmer neighbor upstream. You almost have no idea what's in that water when it comes to you. So this was an attempt to map. I was always looking at things in terms of the architecture. This was an attempt to map all of the potential UNESCO-designated monuments that might be contributing sediment, architectural materials, to the rice fields. But now it becomes very complicated because we're drawing from all these different watersheds, adjacent watersheds that have been, those lines have been crossed by canals. So this kind of very famous Guarini example, another one, Guarini again in Turin. What happens when that brick erodes? Does it find its way into the area's canals and then into those same rice paddies? So that ultimately the idea was that somehow, unwittingly, I did end up talking about the entire western watershed of the Po, because even when you take this simple gesture of looking at the trajectory from the mountains to the plains, it becomes so complicated by hundreds of years of human intervention into the landscape that you end up talking about the entire region as well. Just to say that this project is kind of continuing. I've been working with Shelby to try to think through how to print some of the sediment. This was an initial attempt on printing the actual materials from that chapel to produce a likeness of the chapel. And then this version here at ISU that tries to think through the colorants and how they can be mapped into that elevational map to try to think through what it means in terms of these larger inheritance of both legacy but also toxins from upstream neighbors. So I think to just kind of finish things off, I think that we're very good as architects as being responsible for thinking about buildings. I think things like pre-building, things like post-building, the things that happen before or after, I think we're good at kind of walling that off from what we consider our responsibilities. We call the building architecture, and we call all that other stuff before and after it looks like architecture externalities, right? And I think that my hope is that as we become more and more accountable for what happens before and after our architecture, our buildings, we can kind of expand the range of what we define as architecture. And I will leave it there. Thank you. Yeah.
So we have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to ask that you address questions through the microphone. It's the only way we have of recording it. And sometimes the most interesting parts are the dialogue that happen, the unscripted dialogue. So does anybody have any questions for Josh? And I'll give you the mic.
Hi, thank you so much for a great lecture. Some of my students are here, I hope, from architectural history, and I gave them a little preface to what you would be talking about around the topic of craft and fabrication and the tension in architecture between these two things. So the question I have for you is, could you tell us a little bit about naming your practice radical craft, and what you mean by radical and what you mean by craft?
I think when so there was this moment in it kind of like started in the 90s, maybe a little bit before, but like a lot of art programs were looking at anticipating what was going to happen with the advent of digital techniques, and just assuming that a lot of things like material craft were going to be, they were going to become useless, right? So in particular, a lot of educational institutions, they kind of closed down their ceramics programs, they sold off all of their equipment. I think the same thing happened in a lot of architectural departments as well. They kind of let their wood shops kind of go derelict. And my education was a part of that. And so at the moment when I named my practice, it was also at the moment that this word craft was, like, I think, contested. Some people saw it as less than art, less than architecture. The California College of Arts and Crafts had just decided to shed the craft, and they became the California College of Arts, right? And so I said to myself, well, if you're not interested in the craft, I'm going to pick it up for myself. I'm interested in that. And I think that the idea of, radical craft kind of, for me, was this idea that, okay, I'm going to inject something new and interesting into the world of craft through the introduction of new digital techniques. And I think what I came to learn was that the more interesting version of hybridity was that the world of craft, and material craft in particular, had something really helpful to inject into the world of digital thinking. And I didn't expect that, kind of when I set out on this journey, but I think that clearly at a time when a lot of people would adopt a certain software, and then you could see the way that software would start to dictate a lot of design decisions over and over and kind of replicate itself across the field. Something like materiality pushing against what we could do digitally with ease made for a much more robust test of new technologies from my perspective.
I guess I have a question on why, so we have this whole exploration of where this sediment is going and that it's coming from this monument, and this idea of like where the materials were from before that. So what is the reasoning, or what are you grasping for at the end of like taking that sediment and then remaking it into a smaller scale of that monument?
Yeah, I think that's me struggling with trying to figure out where the project goes next, right? Even the way I kind of set up the slideshow, that's kind of like an afterthought. It is an afterthought, right? So the project is a research project, and it was an exhibition. And so that is done, but somehow I I still want to figure out, like, what does this mean in terms of, for us as a discipline, as architects, what do we do with this research, with this new knowledge? And, part of that is actually trying to figure out, okay, is there a reason to think about building with these same materials again? And that might be a rhetorical exercise, like the thing that I produced that's this big, right? Like, we can't call that architecture, right? It's a likeness of architecture produced with materials coming from architecture, but it's not architecture. However, like, I'm teaching a class in Los Angeles right now called Mining the Metropolis, and the idea behind that is, can we actually document which buildings are available when they're demolished for those construction materials to go back and become reused as construction materials once again? And that could be a technical question. How do we do that? Mm-hmm. It could still be a kind of cultural question, like, what happens when one building is contained inside another building? Do we have some kind of memory of the original building? And that starts to get more interesting for me, and I can tell you, I don't have all the answers to that yet, right? Like, that's just where things are headed next.
Yeah, well, especially you mentioned, like, the building inside a building. We have our Parks Library where the old facade is, like, within now, like, the now facade, you walk in, you have this, like, large atrium, and then you see the old facade. And that was, like, my favorite part of the building, is that you could see a building inside the building, So, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we're all trying to figure out how to do that at different scales, right? So that one is kind of like leaving the facade of an existing building and then building behind it, if I understand correctly. Maybe the inverse. Okay. And then, there's something, I think, as we know, concrete can kind of be recycled, right? Like, but you're actually, it's like that kind of concrete then is broken down into something that is so pulverized that it doesn't necessarily have any personality of its prior self, and it just becomes a kind of increased content of aggregate. So those are two very different ways of thinking about recycling or reusing building components. And I think as a discipline and as a practice, we need to be looking at all of those and everything in between.
Really interesting poetic lecture. I love the kind of diffusion that happens between man-made and non-man-made endeavors. And as an architecture professor, I really think of this word of context, and I'm constantly telling my students, sometimes playfully, like, imagine that your context is the entire surface of the earth, right? And so I really liked this idea of questioning, like, well, how do you actually corral an idea or a project, and what is our responsibility in those externalities? So I think that's quite fascinating, especially when you've kind of found that cross current of man-made canals and things like that. So I guess as a speculative fiction question for you, I would be fascinated to know what your methodology would be if all of a sudden you got commissioned to design a house for somebody in, like, a certain location. How would you take this art practice and kind of apply it specifically to architecture?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think, number one, I think every project needs to start somewhere. And so I think there's something great about all of us holding ourselves responsible to all of the kind of challenges of the planet. And then we also need to just, like, dive in at a certain point, right? And so I like presenting this project in a kind of honest way, like, for me to manage things, I couldn't actually tackle the project that I was asked to tackle to begin with, which wasn't the entire planet. It was just the western watershed of the Po River, right? And even that I couldn't do, right? I just needed to minimize things and say, okay, I'm just going to think about the materials that move along this one very minor tributary to that river. And it's a river that kind of almost nobody would know unless they live on that river, the Cherwell River, right? And so I think, in terms of architectural practice, I think also we need to just start somewhere, right? So I think, it's like, okay, like, what are the prevalent building materials in a particular region to begin with? That's, like, a perfectly good place to start. Is there a reason to question those, like, to critique where they're coming from? And usually what you find is if you do a kind of inventory or an analysis, you find that, there's going to be a whole bunch of polymers and specialized products coming from halfway across the globe. And then there is one aspect of construction materials that are coming from relatively nearby, right? Because it's big, it's heavy, it's difficult to ship. As it turns out, it's concrete, which is a hugely problematic building material, but it also ends up being relatively local. And there's a lot of variation inside of the concrete that we use in different parts of the globe. And then equally, like the concrete for Southern California is very different from the concrete in Northern California because there's different geological aggregates available, right? So, I think for an architectural project, just starting by looking at what the typical materials available would be, that's where I would start. I think that's a perfectly acceptable place to start. And then trying to hone in on the ones where we've got, there's going to be like 80% of the materials that you work with that are going to be really difficult, really challenging to figure out how to replace with something different. Like you're stuck with that, or you just flip to a totally different construction system. But there's going to be about 20% where you've got some wiggle room and you actually do have some agency. And I think that's where we have to locate what we work on, just understanding where we have power and agency, and then saying that, okay, there are certain other aspects where we're not going to be able to we're not going to be able to follow through on the larger project to 100% of what we're happy with in this one project. We get closer and closer with every project. How does that satisfy your question?
I think it's fascinating. I'm also interested in, it would be interesting to see how that manifests, how you would insert some of those themes into the architecture itself.
Yeah.
So that's just totally speculative.
Well, I
just
think
the idea of, at least folding in new themes that are really not, you go back 30 years and nobody's thinking about, in the architecture community, really, this kind of expansion of responsibility potentially.
So the one response I could give to that, which I think is a slightly different question, because it's not about it's not about accountability for materials, but it's more about architectural form and thinking through architectural proper issues, right? Like form and space, and materials at a tectonic scale. And when I show the Trajan's column with its exterior actually moving through its interior. For me, I find that mind-blowing because we always want to attribute some kind of genius to the ancients. Like we want to believe that they totally knew what they were doing and that they didn't leave things to chance. So if that's the case, then Apollodorus of Damascus, the architect, actually had to be intentionally designing a monument that would become the receptacle for its own dissolution, right? Like that. He designed that thing so it would receive itself as it started to dissolve over millennia. And I find that a beautiful way of thinking about architecture. So to imagine a way of starting to produce architecture that thinks through things to that degree, that changes the way we would have to construct it at this moment, not just the materials that we build it out of, but the way that we think about it, and the form and shape that it might take as well.
Maybe I have time for one more question, if anybody has one.
When you talk about the slow motion materiality, I see a lot of explanations about the pre-building of this slow motion. So I wanted to know your perspective about this slow motion on the post-building. So you were talking about these kind of projects that dissolute themselves, that put themselves like, I'm going to dissolute, but is this good? What is your view about this post-building slow motion? Because it can be a contradiction, right? Like, should we go with slow motion, or should we give it an end to it? So I want to see just your perspective.
Yeah, and I think the slow motion version of a building transforming into landscape or transforming into something else is a kind of benign version. Like it doesn't feel very threatening, right? I think obviously if you think about like demolition and the landfilling of architecture at a massive scale, that's something that is less benign, right? It's a little bit more threatening, and we can think about a much stronger problematic relationship that we have between architecture and landscape. And I think when we get to that that point, like that's not necessarily what the specifics of this research were about, but it is part of like the larger project of research. And I have some other research projects that more specifically look at, where are our sites of landfill. So in Los Angeles, I can tell you where our buildings end up when they're no longer buildings, right? And I think that that is something that we're just now starting to grapple with as a profession, as a discipline, is like what happens to our buildings when they're no longer buildings. And your question is like, is it actually appropriate? Is it sometimes good to kind of cut things off and just say, potentially we're going to demolish this building and build something new here? And of course the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no, right? I mean, we know, I kind of do love, Shelby has like a couple times mentioned to me that there's some architects who hate architecture because, and I think that architecture as a discipline is in a little bit of a crisis at this moment because we know that the material production of architecture has some hugely detrimental effects on the landscape, on the planet, right? And at the same time, we know we need more architecture, right? Like we need more housing, right? So we're at this paradox where we shouldn't be building anymore, and at the same time, we need more architecture, right? So I think there's going to be a range of solutions that try to reckon with that kind of crossing of these two contrary trajectories. And some of that is going to be things like adaptive reuse, right? Some of it is going to be about material innovation. And so I don't think that there's one specific answer, that tells us, okay, we actually need to keep all of our buildings for as long as possible. But, at the same time, maybe we could say we should keep all our buildings for as long as possible, but as long as possible is open to debate, right? Like we're able to kind of have discussions about how long as possible actually is.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.